She stood alone in the heart of the Nebraska blaze, barefoot on the parched ground, blood trickling from both knees, trembling like the earth itself had turned its back on her. Clara Wade didn't weep. Her worn linen blouse was torn in jagged strips, clinging to her frame as if it were the only thing holding her together. Overhead, the sun bore down with a merciless weight, so harsh even the gnats seemed to hover around her out of sympathy. She didn't raise a hand to brush the grit from her face. It was as if her body had embraced pain as the only thing she could still claim. Not long before this moment, the folks of Dunmere had jeered at her in the dirt street. Voices, harsh and cutting, branded her a fraud, a crook, a shame. She couldn't fight back. Her words were swallowed by the clamor of men eager to crush her spirit until she shattered. They hauled her past the town's edge, where no one cared what became of a girl with no kin and no strength. They pushed her into the open plain, dust bursting around her like a shotgun blast. Then they turned and left, as if discarding a broken plow. The prairie stood silent, watching as Clara tried to piece together what little of herself remained. But she kept standing because collapsing would mean admitting they'd won. Not a single tree offered shade. In the middle of that empty field, Clara murmured a prayer. Not for rescue, not for a savior. Just a quiet plea to survive long enough to escape the people who'd cast her out like she was nothing. Then, faint in the distance, hooves pounded the earth, slow, measured, deliberate. Riders were coming. She could make out one man leading the group. The others were hazy in the dust behind him. She didn't know if they'd offer aid, turn their backs, or finish what the townsfolk had begun. But one thing was certain: if she fell now, she'd never rise again. Who was the man riding at the front? And would he be the kindness she longed for, or the danger she dreaded? Eli Stone was guiding his cattle when he spotted the girl swaying in the heat, fragile as a lantern flame about to flicker out. Before he could approach, the 3 hired hands trailing him saw her too. Their first instinct wasn't mercy. They reached for their rifles, barrels aimed at Clara as if she were some drifter come to steal livestock under cover of night. Clara's heart sank, and one desperate thought raced through her mind again. More guns. Maybe this time she wouldn't walk away. "Hold on, boss," one hand called out. "Someone's skulking out here. Could be trouble." Clara froze. She'd been thrown out of town like garbage, and now strangers were aiming weapons at her. For a moment she wondered if the prairie had chosen to end her with someone else's bullets. Eli wheeled his horse around and snapped a single order. "Lower those rifles, now!" The hands hesitated. Eli shot them a look that had silenced harder men than these. The rifles dropped to their sides. "That's a girl out there, not a bandit. Open your eyes." Clara watched as he urged his horse closer, stopping just a few paces from her. He took in her tattered blouse, her scraped shins, her bare feet gripping the dirt as if she were trying to anchor herself to the ground to keep from falling. "Ma'am," his voice was calm, steady. "What happened to you?" Clara tried to speak, but her voice cracked into nothing. Her throat was parched, her chest too tight. Eli dismounted, moving slowly, palms open the way you'd approach a wounded animal that might still have enough fight to snap. Clara tensed as he came nearer. For a split second she flinched, her eyes sharp with the kind of fear carved by too many betrayals. But when his jacket brushed her shoulders, she shuddered differently, realizing it was the first touch in hours that didn't carry pain. He draped his worn canvas jacket around her gently. It hung heavy on her slight frame, and she sagged forward, almost sinking into it. "You stay out here one more minute, this sun'll scorch the life out of you. My ranch is nearby. You're coming with me, no arguments." Behind him, the hands traded glances. None dared speak after Eli's sharp command. Clara studied his face. She'd been hurt by enough men to spot danger a mile off, but Eli didn't look at her with greed or distrust. His gaze was quieter, wearier, like a man who'd seen this kind of pain before and wished he'd stopped it sooner. Eli hoped her onto his horse. The herd stirred in the distance, restless and noisy, as if the whole prairie was watching her being carried away from the place where she nearly broke. She didn't know it yet, but this was the first time that day he saved her from the death lurking quietly on the open plain. As they rode towards the ranch, a question gnawed at Clara's mind, one she tried to ignore but couldn't shake. Why did this man seem to understand the weight of the hurt she carried? The ride to the ranch should have been calm, but nothing about that day felt peaceful. Clara gripped the saddle horn, her hands shaking with every jolt over uneven ground. Eli walked beside her, one hand steady on the reins, the other resting near his side, ready for whatever might spring from the dusk. By the time they reached the wooden gate of the stone ranch, the sky had deepened to a heavy indigo, the kind that settles just before night takes hold. Lanterns glowed on the porch, and the cattle in the pen pressed against the rails, agitated by the heat. It should have felt safe. It almost did.
Then hooves thundered behind them, fast and heavy, shaking the dirt beneath their feet. Clara turned, her breath catching. 4 riders, charging hard, dust trailing like a storm cloud. Eli stopped walking. He didn't say a word, but Clara felt the shift in him. His shoulders straightened, his jaw tightened, his eyes hardened like weathered cedar in the sun. The riders pulled up at the gate, reining their horses to a halt. The leader leaned forward in his saddle. Clara recognized him in the dim light. He was from Dunmere, one of the men who dragged her beyond the town line. Eli didn't budge. Even the hands behind him stayed silent. For a long moment, the only sounds were the horses' heavy breaths and the creak of leather. "We're looking for a girl," the leader said. "Said she skipped out on a debt. Said she stole. We're taking her back." Clara's body went rigid. Every instinct urged her to crumple like brittle grass in a gale. She stared at the ground, bracing for Eli to step aside, to hand her over to avoid a fight. But Eli didn't flinch. He moved forward, planting himself between Clara and the men on horseback, and without meaning to, he saved her a second time, this time from the men who wanted to drag her back to the nightmare she'd barely escaped. "No, you won't." His voice was low, steady, like a man who'd lived long enough to stop fearing threats. The riders shifted, uneasy. They'd expected resistance, but not this, not a man who didn't draw a weapon, but stood taller than any gun. "This ranch is my land. She's on my land. Until I hear a judge in Dunmere say otherwise, no one lays a hand on her." The leader opened his mouth, then shut it. He yanked his reins, turning his horse sharply. The others followed, riding off without a word. Clara watched their shapes fade into the dark. Her hands trembled, but for the first time that day, it wasn't fear. It was disbelief that someone had stood up for her. Eli glanced at her, not pressing, not asking, just checking she was still on her feet. And in that quiet moment, Clara wondered something she'd never dared before. Was she finally somewhere a man would protect her because she was worth it, not because he wanted something in return? If this story's stirring something in you, stick around and hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Oh, and while you're here, what time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from? Let me know. The ranch fell quiet after the riders left, but Clara's heartbeat still pounded in her ears. Eli led her toward the broad front porch, steady and unruffled, as if he hadn't just faced down 4 angry men. Inside, the house smelled of aged timber and warm cornbread. It was plain, worn in at spots, but it carried a comfort Clara hadn't felt in ages. Eli gestured to a chair by the table. "Sit. You look like you might collapse." He placed a tin cup of cool water in front of her. She clutched it with both hands, sipping slowly, letting it ease the ache in her chest. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught Eli watching her, not with pity, but like a man studying a storm cloud, trying to gauge the damage it had already done. There was no judgment in his eyes, just a quiet understanding. "You don't owe me any explanations," he said softly, "but if someone's hurt you, I need to know what I'm shielding you from." Clara stared at her scraped palms, the sting of the past day settling deep in her bones. It took a moment before she spoke. "They said things in town, things that weren't true. They wanted to break me with shame. So I left, or they forced me out."
She braced for him to pry, to demand every detail. But Eli just nodded, like he'd seen this kind of cruelty before, like he knew some wounds don't show on the skin. "You're safe here for now," he said. Come morning, we'll sort out what you want to do next." Clara hesitated. She remembered the riders calling her a cheat and a thief. She remembered the heat of their anger. And she remembered how Eli had stepped in front of her without hesitation. "Do you think they'll come back?" Her voice was small, cautious. Eli glanced at the dark window, the night thick and still outside. "If they do, I'll be ready." Later that night, after the house grew still, Clara lay on a narrow cot in the guest room, staring at the ceiling rafters. Sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the old floorboards sounded like boots on the porch. Every shadow seemed like the men from Dunmere returning. Her chest tightened. "If I leave now, before dawn, I won't bring him more trouble." She swung her legs over the cot, slipping on the borrowed boots. Then she crept out the door into the cool night air. Eli was already on the porch, leaning against the rail, the faint glow of his pipe cutting through the dark. He didn't turn, but his voice came low and steady. "Thought you might try to slip away. Figured I'd wait." In that quiet moment, he saved her a third time. Not from men or danger, but from the part of herself that believed she wasn't worth staying for. His words, simple as they were, made her realize something she hadn't dared believe. This man wasn't protecting her out of obligation. He was protecting her because he cared. And that thought scared her more than the writers ever had. Because what was she supposed to do if she started caring back? The sun rose slowly the next morning, casting a soft amber glow across the stone ranch. Clara sat on the porch, wrapped in a clean quilt Eli had left out for her. Her legs still ached, her shoulders felt tender, but there was a strange calm in the early light, like the world had paused just long enough to let her breathe without fear. Eli stepped out with 2 tin mugs of coffee. He handed one to her without a word. They sat together for a while, the silence between them warm and steady, the kind that didn't need filling. "You know, life has a way of kicking folks when they're already down, but it's got this odd habit of putting the right people in your path when you're too worn out to keep going." Clara looked at him, struck by the gentleness in his voice. She'd spent so long believing no one would ever speak to her with kindness again. Yet here was a man who understood broken pieces, not from stories, but from carrying his own. She thought about running, like she'd planned the night before, about hopping a train and starting over somewhere far off. But then she remembered how Eli stood between her and 4 armed riders, how he walked beside her in silence, how he offered help without expecting anything back. Eli set his mug down. "If you want to leave, I'll drive you to the station myself. But if you choose to stay, you and I can figure out how to build something stronger than the things that broke you." Those words hit deep, not because they were grand, but because they were honest, the kind of promise only a man who meant every syllable would make. Clara felt something stir inside her, not fear, not shame, but something closer to hope, the slow, quiet kind that grows when you least expect it. Maybe this was a place where she could stop running, a place where a man like Eli Stone could show her that kindness wasn't a trap and protection wasn't a chain. And maybe, just maybe, her future didn't have to mirror her past. So she looked at Eli with steady eyes and asked the question that had been burning in her heart since he first stood between her and danger. "What if I choose to stay? What if I choose to fight for something better with you?" A thought bloomed in her chest before she could stop it, a fragile hope that maybe her future wasn't just beside him for safety, but someday as the woman who shared his life, his home, his name. Eli looked at her for a long moment, something soft easing the hard lines of his face. He said, "Then we start with breakfast." And for the first time since the world turned against her, Clara felt a real smile break across her face. Before you hear what Eli said next, let me ask you this. If this story's given you even a spark of strength today, would you hit like so it can reach someone else who needs it? And if you love riding along with me through these old prairie tales, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Now, tell me, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you listening from?